All right, so we are diving deep today into medieval Europe.
A fascinating period.
It is. And we're using these excerpts from a history textbook module.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, it's called Church and Society in Western Europe,
Okay.
to kind of see how some of these major events
Right.
really reshape Europe. And we're talking like the Crusades,
Jeez.
the 100 Years' War,
Yeah.
Black Death, all that.
Yeah, it's remarkable how those things all kind of like tie together.
Yeah.
You've got religious zeal, you've got these economic shifts,
Yeah.
and then these just like devastating calamities, and they all come together to create like the world we know today.
Yeah, it's like history's not a neat little timeline.
No, not at all.
It's like a giant, messy
To tapestry.
tapestry.
Yeah, definitely.
So let's start with probably like the biggest player in this whole story,
Okay.
the church.
Yeah.
Our text really emphasizes that in this fragmented Europe, the church was really like a unifying force.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. Amidst all the like power struggles and the different kingdoms, you've got the church, this stable force providing like a shared identity across all those divides.
Right. So beyond just spiritual guidance too, right?
Oh, yeah.
The text mentions that the church kind of functioned almost like a kingdom itself.
It did.
It had its own laws and courts and even like collected taxes.
Absolutely. So they had their own legal system called canon law.
Wow.
They had their own courts to enforce it, and they collected taxes in the form of tithes.
That's a lot of power.
It really made the church incredibly powerful, almost like rivaling the kings.
Right, because you have that whole thing.
The two swords,
Yeah.
where the Pope holds that spiritual authority and the kings hold the political authority.
Always causing some friction.
Oh, yeah, constantly.
And speaking of friction, we can't forget the story of Henry V's journey to Canossa
Oh,
in
yeah.
1077.
What a story.
A holy Roman emperor standing barefoot in the snow for 3 days to beg forgiveness from the Pope.
I mean, that image just sums it up perfectly.
It's phrasing.
The church wielded immense power.
Yeah, so what was he even doing?
Well, Henry V challenged the Pope's authority to appoint church officials.
Oh, so he got in big trouble.
Big trouble. The Pope excommunicated him.
Oh, wow.
So to get back in good graces, he had to publicly humiliate himself.
That's intense.
It shows you that spiritual authority could be a powerful political weapon.
Wow. So was the Concordat of Worms like the peace treaty after all that drama?
Pretty much, they were trying to find a compromise, some sort of middle ground.
Okay.
The agreement let the church appoint the bishops,
Okay.
but the emperor got veto power.
Gotcha.
It just highlights those ongoing power struggles, that shaped Europe's political landscape for centuries.
Yeah, and we still see stuff like that today.
We do, maybe a little less dramatic, though.
Hopefully.
Yeah, no more standing barefoot in the snow.
So now let's switch gears to the Crusades.
Okay.
Series of religious wars launch to take control of the Holy Land.
Right.
It's a lot to unpack what was really driving them.
It was more than just religious zeal, though. That was a big part of it.
Oh.
But you've also got political ambition in there.
Right.
Economic opportunity.
Oh, interesting.
Even social factors. So you had kings using the Crusades to get rid of troublesome knights.
Oh, yeah?
You had younger sons who were looking for land and a way to, gain wealth and status.
Like go west, young man, but in medieval Europe.
Exactly. And remember, religion was central to life back then.
Right.
So think about that first crusade.
Okay.
They were ill-prepared, these crusaders,
Yeah.
constantly arguing amongst themselves.
Sounds about right.
But they managed to capture Jerusalem in 1099.
Wow.
That's the power of belief.
And then you have Saladin.
Oh, yeah.
This legendary Muslim leader takes Jerusalem back in 1187.
Yeah, it was a constant back and forth.
So what lasting impacts did all these crusades have on Europe?
Well, even though they failed to permanently secure Christian control of the Holy Land, they did open up these trade routes and brought new knowledge to Europe.
Okay.
Things like Arabic numerals, advancements in medicine, and it really shaped the relationship between Christianity and Islam
Right.
in ways that I think we still see today.
It makes you think about the legacy of these events.
Definitely.
Okay, let's move on to something a little less war-torn.
Okay.
This period also saw some pretty big changes in European society,
Right.
especially with the rise of towns and the way that people lived and worked.
Yeah, they call that the commercial revolution.
Okay.
And it was a revolution, but not like a sudden violent one. It
Right.
was more of a profound shift in how people lived and worked.
Gotcha. So what kind of changes are we talking about?
Well, think about innovations in agriculture, like the three-field system.
Okay.
So instead of leaving half their land fallow, they could rotate crops on 2/3 of it.
Okay.
And that led to increased food production.
Makes sense.
And horses were replacing oxen so they could plow even more land.
So a small change leads to huge ripple effects.
Exactly. More food, healthier population, longer lifespans,
Yeah.
which all contribute to the growth of towns.
Right. And then you have these guilds starting to emerge.
Yes, guilds were these organizations of merchants and craftspeople,
Okay.
kind of like early versions of unions,
Interesting.
setting standards for quality wages and working conditions.
And I bet this new way of life was really appealing
Oh, yeah.
to folks who were tied to the land under the feudal system.
Absolutely, serfs looking for freedom and opportunity.
Yeah.
They must have felt like they were stepping into a whole new world.
I can imagine. And it wasn't just about opportunity, right?
No, it was a shift in the whole social order.
How so?
This new merchant class emerged.
Right.
They called them burghers, and they didn't really fit into those old categories of nobles, clergy, and peasants.
Right.
And they were accumulating wealth, demanding political rights,
Wow.
challenging the existing power structures.
So that's a key part of the decline of feudalism then.
It is.
Fascinating. And all of this was happening along with a revival of learning.
It's ironic, isn't it?
Yeah.
These religious wars, the Crusades, actually sparked a rediscovery of classical knowledge.
Later they went to fight and came back with books.
Basically, Christian scholars started visiting these Muslim libraries in Spain,
Okay.
and they rediscovered the works of Greek philosophers like Aristotle.
Wow. So this led to the rise of universities.
Yeah, first in places like Bologna and Paris.
Cool. And the text also mentions Dante Chaucer and Christine de Pizan writing in the vernacular.
Yes.
That's a huge change from just using Latin.
It was crucial, that shift.
Yeah.
Writing in the vernacular made knowledge and literature more accessible.
Right.
And it contributed to a broader cultural transformation.
And we also see thinkers like Thomas Aquinas emerge, right?
Right.
Trying to reconcile faith and reason.
So that's showing how intellectual inquiry was changing how people saw the world.
Absolutely.
So we're seeing Europe changing on multiple fronts.
Yeah.
The church's power is being challenged.
Mhm.
Society is evolving.
Yeah.
This thirst for knowledge is growing. But then things take a pretty dark turn. They do. The 14th century throws some major curveballs at Europe.
Oh, boy.
But that's a story for our next segment.
All right, buckle up. Things are about to get intense.
They are. Oh, yeah, the 14th century. It really was a tough time for Europe.
Yeah, it sounds like the universe just decided to throw everything it had at them.
Doesn't it? You've got a divided church, you've got famine, and then
And then the Black Death.
the Black Death. Yeah.
The textbook really doesn't hold back on how devastating that was. A third of Europe's population wiped out. It's just unimaginable.
Yeah, it's hard to even fathom that kind of loss.
Yeah. What kind of impact does that even have on society?
I mean, it completely upended everything. The social order was just shattered.
Right.
People were terrified. Boccaccio even wrote about families abandoning each other.
Wow.
They were so afraid of getting sick. It's a chilling testament to how this unknown threat just completely broke down those social bonds.
Yeah. And it's not like it was a one-time thing, right?
No, the plague kept coming back.
Oh, gosh.
For years. These waves of it.
So on top of all of that, you've got the church, which had always been this symbol of stability.
Right.
It was facing its own internal struggles, too.
Yeah, even before the plague hit, the church was already weakened by conflict internally.
Oh, right. Like that whole clash between Pope Boniface VIII and King Philip V of France.
Exactly. Boniface was trying to assert the Pope's authority over kings, but Philip basically said, nope, not going to happen.
Yeah. What a power move.
It was a major blow to papal authority.
So the papacy never really recovered from that.
Not really. And then it gets even worse with the Great Schism.
Oh, yeah. With two popes.
Two popes, one in Rome, one in Avignon, both claiming to be the true leader of the church.
Can you imagine the confusion?
It was a huge crisis of faith for a lot of people.
Yeah, and then on top of that, you've got people like John Wycliffe and Jan Hus challenging the church's authority even further.
Right. They were arguing that the Bible, not the Pope, was the ultimate authority.
It really shows how much things were changing.
It does. People were starting to question those long-held beliefs and traditions.
So the church's authority, which had always been absolute, was being challenged.
Exactly. It was a sign of the times.
And all of this is happening while England and France are moving toward more centralized governments.
Yeah, you're starting to see the groundwork being laid for the nation-states we know today.
Okay, so in England, it starts with William the Conqueror.
Right. His victory at the Battle of Hastings in 1066.
That was a major turning point.
It was, he takes control, distributes land to his Norman lords, and establishes a more unified government.
And then you've got King Henry II.
Oh, yeah, Henry II, he reformed the legal system,
Okay.
introduced juries, and common law.
Those are huge changes.
Yeah, and they still have an impact today.
That's crazy to think about.
Think about trial by a jury of your peers. It's a cornerstone of our legal systems.
Right.
And common law being based on precedent.
Okay.
It creates a more consistent and fair system of justice.
And then, of course, there's the Magna Carta.
Oh, yes, the Magna Carta.
That's so interesting how this document meant to protect the rights of nobles became this symbol of limiting royal power.
It was a crucial step towards a more balanced relationship between the ruler and the ruled.
So not immediate democracy, but a step in that direction.
Exactly.
And while all of this is going on in England, you got the Capetian dynasty in France,
Right.
slowly consolidating power.
It was a much slower process over there.
Okay.
Those Capetian kings had to carefully expand their control.
Starting from Paris?
Yeah, navigating those feudal allegiances, but they had some key figures.
Like Philip II?
Philip Augustus, he tripled the lands under his control and established a more efficient system of administration.
Wow, he sounds pretty impressive.
He was a smart guy, and he wasn't afraid to challenge the church either.
Right. Calling the Estates General and including commoners.
Yeah, that was a bold move.
It was.
The Estates General, with representation from the clergy, the nobility, and the commoners,
Yeah.
it became a key institution in French politics.
So we're seeing this parallel development of nation building
Yeah.
and these early democratic institutions.
Yes, in both England and France.
And it's all happening at the same time as the plague and war and religious upheaval.
It's amazing, isn't it? It shows how resilient and adaptive societies can be.
It does. Even in the face of crisis, there's this drive to create, to innovate, to build something new.
Exactly.
And speaking of upheaval, we can't forget about the 100 Years' War.
Oh, yes. A war that lasted over a century.
It's mind-boggling.
It is. It speaks to that deep rivalry between England and France.
It does. But I'm also struck by how it marked a shift in warfare itself.
Absolutely.
The longbow changed everything.
It did. It was a game changer. Suddenly, knights, those heavily armored symbols of medieval warfare,
Right.
they were vulnerable to this relatively low-tech weapon.
I bet that was a shock.
I think it's safe to say it was.
And those English victories at Crécy-Poitiers and Agincourt, they really cemented the longbow's place in history.
They did, and it's almost symbolic of how that old order was being challenged and disrupted.
It's a perfect metaphor, right?
It is how new technologies and changing social forces can overturn even the most entrenched systems and traditions.
And then you've got Joan of Arc.
Oh, yes, the peasant girl turned national heroine.
Such an inspiring and tragic story.
It really captures the imagination, doesn't it? Joan's conviction, her courage, her tragic end.
Yeah,
It's all very Shakespearean.
it is. But it also highlights the power of religious belief and national sentiment during this conflict.
Absolutely. She was able to rally the French troops and turn the tide of the war.
At least for a little while.
It speaks to the power of belief, of inspiration, and it underscores that growing sense of national identity
Okay.
that was emerging in both England and France.
So by the end of the 14th century,
Yes,
Europe has been ravaged by plague war, internal conflict.
it had.
But it's also a Europe on the cusp of major transformation.
It is the old medieval world with its feudal structures and unquestioned religious authority. It's crumbling.
And from the ruins, a new era is about to begin.
The Renaissance, the rise of nation-states, a new chapter in European history.
It's crazy to think that a war that lasted for over a century ultimately marked the end of an era.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the 100 Years' War really solidified those national identities in both England and France.
Yeah, and it's interesting how war, despite all the devastation, can also be a catalyst for change.
It's true. I mean, people started to see their kings not as these feudal overlords anymore, but as national leaders,
Right.
symbols of their country's hopes and dreams.
And the text also mentions the emergence of parliaments and representative assemblies.
Oh, yeah, those were important.
What was their impact?
Well, they reflected a movement toward giving people a say in their government. You
Right.
know, like in England, you had the model parliament,
Right.
and in France, you had the Estates General.
Okay.
Now, they differed in how much power and influence they had,
Right.
but both of them represented a step away from absolute monarchy.
Yeah, it's like planting those early seeds of democracy.
Yeah, you could say that for sure. They were fragile, though.
But they were there.
They were there.
I keep thinking about that image of the longbow
Oh, yeah.
and how it basically made knights obsolete.
It's such a powerful metaphor, isn't it?
It is for like the end of chivalry in the medieval world.
It really is. It's like a visual representation of how those old systems and traditions can be completely overturned by new technologies and shifting social forces.
So let's zoom out for a second.
Okay.
Why should we care about all of this stuff that happened centuries ago?
Right. Good question. I mean, these events of the 14th century, they really had a massive impact on the course of European history.
Right.
Which in turn shaped the world we live in today. I mean, the decline of the church's authority, that paved the way for the Reformation.
Right.
The rise of secular power. The societal changes fueled by economic growth in those growing towns. That set the stage for the Renaissance and like a more modern way of thinking.
And of course, the development of national identities shaped the political landscape of Europe.
Absolutely.
For centuries.
Yeah, it's like we're living in the world that they built.
And dealing with the consequences of their choices.
That's one way to look at it.
So here's a thought. Could this whole shift away from the church and towards these stronger national identities, could it have happened without all the turmoil of the 14th century?
That is the question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Historians are still debating that today.
Right.
It's impossible to know for sure, but it does make you wonder.
It does.
You know, if sometimes those periods of like intense upheaval, if they're necessary to break down those old structures and make way for new ones.
Right, like maybe it's in those moments of crisis.
Exactly.
The societies are forced to really look at themselves.
Yeah, re-examine their values, their institutions, and ultimately redefine who they are.
It makes you wonder if people, centuries from now,
oh, I'm sure they will
be asking those same questions about our time.
Exactly. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring this period in history, you know?
Yeah.
Delve a little deeper into the stories and events that we've talked about.
And discover how those echoes of the 14th century are still shaping the world today.